The gunshot that echoed through the dusty streets of Santa Fe, New Mexico, sent Penelope Kincaid diving behind the wooden water trough. So fast, she scraped both palms bloody on the rough planks, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might tear through her ribcage and scatter across the dirt like the frightened jackrabbits that bounded through the scrubland at dawn. It was only a celebration, some drunk cowhand firing into the air because he had won at cards. But Penelope could not distinguish between celebration and execution, between joy and terror, between the living and the ghosts that still screamed in her memory from that terrible night 6 months ago, when everything she knew turned to blood and smoke. The year was 1878, and Santa Fe bustled with miners, ranchers, merchants, and drifters all seeking their fortune or running from their past. And Penelope firmly belonged to the latter category, though she tried desperately to blend into the former. She had arrived 3 weeks ago on a supply wagon driven by a kind Mexican family who asked no questions about the haunted look in her gray eyes, or why a 22-year-old woman with good manners and educated speech would be traveling alone with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather satchel containing a Bible, a tintype photograph she could not bear to look at, and $17 in crumpled bills. She found work quickly enough at the boarding house run by Mrs. Henderson, a stern but fair widow who needed help with the cooking and cleaning now that her arthritis made climbing stairs an ordeal. The work was honest, and the pay modest, but it came with a small room under the eaves and 2 meals a day, which was more security than Penelope had known since that night when the raiders came to her family's homestead in eastern Kansas and murdered her parents and younger brother while she hid in the root cellar like a coward, pressed against the damp earth with her hand clamped over her mouth to muffle her sobs as boots thundered overhead and her mother's screams cut through the darkness. Now, every loud sound sent her back to that cellar, back to that helpless terror, back to the moment when the screaming stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than any noise could ever be. The other residents of the boarding house learned quickly to announce themselves before entering a room where Penelope worked, to avoid slamming doors, to keep their voices moderate, but the town itself had no such consideration. Santa Fe in the late 1870s was a cacophony of sound. Wagon wheels clattering over stones, hammers ringing against anvils, dogs barking, horses neighing, men shouting, women calling to their children, and worst of all, the occasional gunshot that could mean anything from a rattlesnake being dispatched to a dispute being settled in the most permanent way possible. Penelope tried to manage her fear with small rituals and careful planning. She mapped the quietest routes through town for her errands. She shopped early in the morning before the streets grew crowded and chaotic. She kept her eyes down and moved quickly, a gray shadow in a faded blue dress that had once been her mother's second-best Sunday outfit, and now hung loose on Penelope's diminished frame, because food often stuck in her throat when the memories rose up too strongly. It was on one of these early morning errands, hurrying to the general store for lamp oil and thread, that Penelope first encountered Yates Larson. She did not actually see him at first, only heard the sudden jingle of spurs behind her, and whirled around with such violent alarm that she dropped her basket and stumbled backward into a hitching post. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, and her vision tunneled to a pinpoint while her heart attempted to beat its way out of her chest. "Madam." The voice was low and careful, barely above a murmur. "Did not mean to startle you. Are you all right?" Penelope forced her eyes to focus on the man who had spoken. He stood a respectful distance away, one hand raised in a gesture of peace, the other holding his hat against his chest. He was tall and lean, probably around 26 or 27 years old, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his dusty shirt. His eyes were an unexpected shade of hazel, green and gold mixed together like sunlight filtering through cottonwood leaves, and those eyes watched her with a concern that held no pity, only an earnest desire to help. "I am fine," Penelope managed, though her voice shook. "You simply surprised me." The cowboy, for that was clearly what he was based on his worn leather chaps and the rope looped at his hip, nodded slowly. He bent down, moving with deliberate gentleness, and retrieved her fallen basket. When he straightened, he held it out to her but did not step closer, allowing her to come to him when she was ready. "Yates Larson, madam," he said quietly. "I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles west of town. Just came in for supplies." He paused, then added, "I will try to walk more softly in the future." Something in the way he said it, without mockery or condescension, just a simple statement of intent, made Penelope's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them away fiercely and stepped forward to take her basket. "Penelope Kincaid," she said, and was surprised to find herself offering her name so readily. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Larson. Just Yates, if you do not mind, Miss Kincaid." He settled his hat back on his head with movements that were slow and smooth, nothing sudden or sharp. "I hope you have a peaceful morning." He touched 2 fingers to his hat brim in a gentle salute and then walked past her, his spurs no longer jingling because, she realized, he had somehow silenced them, perhaps holding them still with each step or walking in a way that kept the rolls from spinning. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it struck her as extraordinarily thoughtful, and she found herself watching his broad-shouldered form as he continued down the street until he turned into the general store and disappeared from view. Over the following weeks, Penelope saw Yates Larson several more times, always in the early morning when she ventured out for errands. She began to suspect he was timing his trips to town to coincide with hers, though she could not imagine why a working cowboy would alter his schedule for a skittish woman he barely knew. Yet there he was, week after week, always maintaining a respectful distance, always announcing his presence with a quiet greeting before he came too close, always moving with that same deliberate gentleness that never felt patronizing, only considerate. He began to walk alongside her sometimes, if their errands took them in the same direction, and his presence became something of a comfort. When other people approached too quickly or spoke too loudly, Yates would subtly position himself between them and Penelope, not in an aggressive or possessive way, but simply creating a buffer that gave her space to compose herself. He never asked about her past or why she startled so easily, never pushed her to explain herself, never made her feel broken or damaged. He simply accepted her as she was and adjusted his behavior accordingly. "You handle horses?" Penelope asked him one morning in early June as they walked together toward the boarding house, where she needed to return before beginning the breakfast preparations. The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She was not usually one to initiate conversation. "Yes, madam," Yates replied. "That is mostly what I do at the Double R. We breed and train cow ponies. I have a gift for working with the difficult ones, or so my boss tells me." "Difficult ones," the horses that have been mishandled or mistreated. The ones that are too frightened or angry to trust people anymore. He glanced at her, and something in his expression made her think he was not really talking about horses at all. "They need patience and consistency. You cannot force trust. You have to earn it bit by bit, day by day, by proving that you will not hurt them, by showing up and being gentle and predictable until one day they realize they feel safe with you." Penelope felt her throat tighten. "And does it work? Can they ever truly recover?" "Some do. some do not. But all of them deserve the chance to try, and all of them deserve to be treated with kindness regardless of whether they ever fully heal. Yates stopped walking as they reached the boarding house steps. Trauma changes a creature, horse or human. It leaves marks that do not always fade. But that does not mean there cannot be good days again. It does not mean joy is impossible. It just means the path forward looks different than it might have otherwise. Penelope studied his face, this unexpected cowboy with his quiet wisdom and patient eyes. "You speak from experience." "Some," he acknowledged. "Lost my parents and my sister to cholera when I was 19. Came west to outrun the grief, but it followed me anyway. Learned eventually that you cannot outrun it. You can only learn to carry it." The shared understanding that passed between them in that moment needed no words. Penelope nodded slowly, and Yates touched his hat brim in his customary farewell, and they parted ways with something new and fragile established between them. As summer deepened, and the heat pressed down on Santa Fe like a heavy blanket, Yates continued to appear during Penelope's morning errands with such regularity that Mrs. Henderson noticed and commented. "That Larson boy seems quite taken with you," the older woman said one afternoon while Penelope kneaded bread dough in the boarding house kitchen. "He is a good man from what I hear, hard-working, honest, does not drink to excess or gamble away his wages." Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm kitchen. "He has been kind to me, that is all. Kindness is not nothing, child." Mrs. Henderson's arthritic fingers worked at snapping green beans, her movements slow but steady. "In fact, it is quite something, especially when it is genuine and freely given. That man goes out of his way for you. I have eyes in my head. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I do not know if I can," Penelope said quietly, shaping the dough into loaves with more force than necessary. "I am not who I was before. I do not know if I can be what someone would need. He does not seem to want you to be anything other than who you are right now, Mrs." Henderson set aside her bowl of prepared beans and fixed Penelope with a knowing look. "And you are already more than you give yourself credit for. You survived something terrible. You picked yourself up. You traveled alone to a new place and made a new life. You work hard. You are learning to manage your fear. Those are not small things, Penelope. Those are extraordinary things." Penelope wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that survival counted as strength rather than cowardice. But the voice of doubt that had taken up residence in her mind since that terrible night whispered that she had only survived because she had hidden, because she had done nothing while her family was slaughtered, because she was weak. As if summoning her thoughts into being, a loud crash sounded from somewhere outside, probably a merchant dropping a crate, and Penelope flinched so violently she knocked over the flour tin. White powder exploded across the kitchen table in a choking cloud, and Penelope found herself backed into the corner with her hands pressed flat against the wall and her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mrs. Henderson moved as quickly as her old bones allowed, coming to stand nearby but not touching, giving Penelope space to remember where she was, who she was with, that she was safe. "You are in Santa Fe," Mrs. Henderson said in her calm, matter-of-fact voice. "You are in my kitchen." It is June 12, 1878. That noise was someone in the street, nothing more. You are safe here, child. Breathe slowly, in and out. That is right. It took several minutes for Penelope's heartbeat to slow, for her breathing to even out, for the present moment to feel real again instead of translucent and thin, barely covering the memories that lurked beneath like rocks under shallow water, always threatening to trip her up. "I am sorry," Penelope whispered. "I am sorry. The flour is just flour. We have more, and you have nothing to apologize for." Mrs. Henderson squeezed Penelope's shoulder gently. "But perhaps you should talk to someone about what happened to you. Perhaps Yates Larson, if you trust him. Keeping it locked inside only gives it more power over you." The thought of speaking about that night out loud, of putting words to the horror she had witnessed, and the shame she felt at her own survival, made Penelope feel physically ill. But she also recognized the truth in Mrs. Henderson's words. The secret festered inside her like an infected wound, and wounds needed to be cleaned and exposed to air in order to heal. The following week, when Yates appeared as usual during her early morning walk to the general store, Penelope gathered her courage and asked, "Would you like to take a walk?" Not for errands, just to walk and talk. Something in Yates's expression softened and he nodded. "I would like that very much." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land, dusty and brown with occasional scrub brush and hardy wildflowers clinging to life despite the heat. The sun was still low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and the morning air had not yet taken on the oppressive weight it would carry by midday. Yates matched his pace to hers and kept his hands loosely at his sides, his whole posture open and unthreatening. He did not push her to speak, simply walked beside her in companionable silence, and that patience gave Penelope the courage to begin. "6 months ago, my family had a homestead in eastern Kansas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was not much, but it was ours. My father farmed wheat and corn. My mother kept chickens and a garden. My brother Samuel was 14 and obsessed with dime novels about cowboys and outlaws." She smiled slightly at the memory, bitter and sweet all at once. Yates listened without interrupting, without trying to fill the silence when she paused to gather her thoughts or swallow back tears. "Raiders came one night in December. I do not know who they were or why they targeted us. Perhaps they thought we had money hidden away, though we barely scraped by most years. Perhaps they were just cruel men who enjoyed causing pain." Penelope's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I was in the root cellar fetching preserves for dinner. I heard the shouting and the gunshots. I heard my mother screaming. I heard Samuel crying out, and I did nothing. I hid in the cellar like a coward and pressed my hands over my ears and prayed for it to stop." "You survived," Yates said quietly. "That took courage, not cowardice. I let them die." The words tore out of Penelope like broken glass. "I should have done something, anything. But I was too frightened, so I hid, and when I finally came out hours later, they were all gone. My father was in the yard. My mother was in the kitchen. Samuel was by the barn. And I was alive because I had hidden in the earth like a rabbit while they were murdered." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, months of grief and guilt and horror pouring out in great, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She expected Yates to recoil, to tell her she was right to feel guilty, to walk away from this broken woman who could not even save her own family. Instead, he carefully, slowly, telegraphing his movements so she could see them coming, reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip gentle but steady. "Listen to me, Penelope," he said, and there was a firmness in his voice that made her look at him through her tears. "You did not let them die. You did not kill them. Cruel men with guns killed them, and if you had been there, you would be dead too. Your survival was not cowardice. Your survival was what your parents would have wanted for you. If they could speak to you now, do you think they would want you to feel guilty for living? Or would they want you to honor their memory by building a life worth living?" Penelope had not considered it from that angle before, had been so consumed by her own guilt that she had not thought about what her parents would actually want for her. Her mother, practical and loving, who always put her children's welfare above her own. Her father, quiet and steady, who worked himself to exhaustion to provide for his family. Would they truly want her to drown in guilt and shame? Or would they want her to survive, to thrive, to find happiness despite the tragedy that had befallen them? "I do not know how to let go of the guilt," she admitted. "I do not think you ever fully let it go," Yates said, "but you can learn to carry it differently. You can learn to honor your family by living well instead of punishing yourself for surviving. And you do not have to do it alone." The implication in those last words hung in the air between them, and Penelope found herself gripping his hand tighter, as if he were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Why do you care?" she asked. "Why do you keep showing up for someone as damaged as me?" Yates was quiet for a long moment, his hazel eyes searching her face. "Because I see you," he finally said. "Not the fear or the trauma. I see the strength it takes to get up every morning despite the nightmares. I see the courage it takes to live in a noisy, chaotic town when every loud sound sends you back to the worst moment of your life. I see a woman who is doing her best to heal, and I think that is the bravest thing a person can do." He paused. "And because somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." The confession was so simple, so honest, that it stole Penelope's breath. She stared at him, this gentle cowboy who had learned to silence his spurs and soften his footsteps, who had adjusted his entire way of moving through the world to make her feel safe, who saw her as brave when she felt like a coward. "I am afraid," she whispered. "Of me. Of caring for someone and losing them again. Of opening my heart and having it destroyed. Of being happy only to have that happiness torn away." The tears had slowed, but her eyes still burned. "I do not know if I can survive that kind of loss again." "There are no guarantees," Yates said. "I cannot promise I will never die or that tragedy will never strike again. Life is uncertain and often unfair. But I can promise that I will be as careful as I can be. I can promise that I will show up for you every day that I am able. I can promise that I will learn what you need and do my best to provide it. And I can promise that whatever time we have together, whether it is 1 year or 50, will be filled with as much love and gentleness as I can give." He squeezed her hand carefully. "Is that enough?" Penelope thought about the alternative. Living a half-life defined by fear and isolation, never letting anyone close, existing but not truly living. Her family was gone and nothing would bring them back, but she was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than grief and terror. Was she brave enough to try? "It is enough," she said, and felt something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since that terrible December night, begin to loosen just slightly. "But I need time. I need patience. I need you to understand that I will have bad days and that recovery is not a straight line." "I know," Yates said, "and I am not going anywhere." They stood there in the early morning light, hands clasped, and made no grand declarations or dramatic gestures. They simply acknowledged the fragile, tentative beginning of something that might, with time and care, grow into something strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Yates courted Penelope with a gentleness that would have seemed comical if it were not so deeply touching. He brought her wildflowers picked from the scrubland, their stems wrapped in damp cloth to keep them fresh. He carved her a small wooden bird that fit perfectly in her palm, smooth and soothing to hold when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. He taught her to ride a gentle mare from the Double R Ranch, a calm creature with soft eyes who did not spook easily. And together, they took slow rides into the countryside where the open space and relative quiet helped Penelope feel like she could breathe fully for the first time in months. He learned her triggers and her tells, recognized when she was beginning to spiral, and knew how to gently pull her back to the present. He learned that she liked her coffee with honey and cream, that she hummed quietly when she was content, that she had a sharp wit that emerged when she felt safe enough to let down her guard. He learned that she was stronger than she gave herself credit for, that her compassion had not been destroyed by tragedy, that she laughed with her whole body when something truly delighted her, a rare and precious gift that he treasured every time he was lucky enough to witness it. Penelope, in turn, learned that Yates was a man of deep feeling who expressed himself through actions rather than words. She learned that he loved the early morning hours when the world was still quiet, that he had a talent for sketching horses and landscapes in a small journal he carried, that he sent money every month to his younger cousin back east to help pay for his education. She learned that his patience was not infinite, but that his temper, when roused, was directed at injustice rather than inconvenience, that he would go out of his way to help someone in need even at cost to himself, that he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station or background. She also learned that he had his own scars, his own ghosts. He still sometimes woke from nightmares about the cholera epidemic that had taken his family, still struggled with the guilt of being the only one who survived, still wondered if there was something more he could have done. Understanding that he too carried the weight of survival, that he too knew the complicated grief of being alive when loved ones were not, created a bond between them that went deeper than simple attraction or affection. They recognized each other in a fundamental way, two people who had walked through fire and come out changed, but not destroyed. By late July, when the heat pressed down on Santa Fe like a physical force and everyone moved slowly through the thick air, Yates asked Penelope to accompany him to a dance being held to celebrate the birthday of one of the prominent ranchers in the area. She nearly refused, knowing that dances meant crowds and noise and all the things that sent her anxiety spiraling, but something in Yates's eyes, hopeful but understanding, made her want to try. "We can leave at any time," he promised. "The moment it becomes too much, we go. No questions asked. No shame or guilt. We simply leave." The dance was held in the largest barn at the Double R Ranch, decorated with lanterns and bunting, with long tables set up outside for food and drink. There were easily 60 people in attendance, maybe more, and the fiddle music and stomping feet created a wall of sound that made Penelope's heart race the moment they arrived. Yates took her hand and led her to a quiet corner, positioning himself so that she had a wall at her back and he stood between her and the majority of the crowd. "Just breathe," he said quietly. "We do not have to dance. We can just stand here and watch, or we can leave. Whatever you need." Penelope watched the dancers spinning and laughing, watched the way people moved together with joy and abandon, and felt a fierce longing to be able to do the same, to be able to participate in life without fear, constantly whispering warnings in her ear. "I want to try," she said, surprising herself. "Just one dance. If it is too much, we will stop." Yates led her onto the floor as a slower song began, something gentle and swaying rather than the wild reels that had dominated earlier. He placed one hand carefully at her waist and took her other hand in his, holding her loosely enough that she never felt trapped or confined. They moved together slowly, Yates humming the melody quietly, so she could focus on his voice rather than the overwhelming cacophony of the crowd. For those few minutes, Penelope felt something approaching normal. She felt young and alive and capable of joy. She felt the warmth of Yates's hand at her waist and saw the way he looked at her, like she was precious and perfect exactly as she was, scars and all. She felt the possibility of a future that held more than just survival, that might actually contain happiness. The song ended and another began, this one faster and louder, and Penelope felt the familiar tightness beginning in her chest. Yates saw it immediately and led her outside into the relative quiet of the summer night without a word, no judgment or disappointment in his expression, only concern for her well-being. "You did wonderfully," he said once they were away from the barn, the music fading to a manageable level. "That took real courage." "I wanted to stay longer," Penelope admitted. "I wanted to be able to just enjoy it without my body betraying me." "You will get there," Yates said with such certainty that she almost believed him. "Healing is not linear. Some days will be better than others." "But you are making progress, Penelope. You are doing the hard work. That matters." They walked together under the stars, the night air finally cooling after the oppressive heat of the day, and talked about the future in vague, tentative terms. Yates spoke about his dream of eventually having his own small ranch, just a few acres where he could train horses and maybe run some cattle. Penelope spoke about possibly teaching, using the education her parents had sacrificed to give her to help other children learn to read and write and cipher. They were dreams that fit together easily, that did not require either of them to give up essential parts of themselves, dreams that felt possible if they were willing to work for them. In August, a traveling preacher came through Santa Fe and held revival meetings in a large tent at the edge of town. Mrs. Henderson wanted to attend and asked Penelope to accompany her, and Penelope agreed despite her misgivings about the crowd and the potential for overwhelming noise. Yates came as well, sitting on Penelope's other side, his presence a quiet reassurance. The preacher was a dramatic speaker, his voice rising and falling, his fist pounding the makeshift pulpit for emphasis, and each bang made Penelope flinch despite her best efforts to remain calm. Yates noticed, of course, and carefully shifted closer so that his shoulder pressed against hers, a grounding point in the storm of sound and sensation. The sermon was about forgiveness, about releasing guilt and accepting grace, and Penelope found herself listening despite her discomfort. The preacher spoke about how holding on to guilt and shame was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die, how true healing required acknowledging the pain, but not allowing it to define you, how God's mercy extended even to those who felt unworthy of it. Penelope had never been particularly religious, her family's faith practical and understated rather than fervent, but something in the words reached her. She thought about the guilt she carried for surviving, the shame she felt for hiding while her family was murdered, and she thought about what Yates had said weeks ago about how her parents would want her to honor their memory by living well. Maybe forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, was not about forgetting or excusing what happened. Maybe it was about acknowledging the reality of the situation, recognizing that she had done the only thing she could do in that moment, and choosing to move forward despite the scars. Maybe it was about accepting that she was human and fallible, and that survival in the face of horror was not something to be ashamed of. When the service ended and people filed out of the tent, Penelope felt lighter somehow, as if a small portion of the weight she carried had been lifted. She knew the guilt would not disappear overnight, that she would still have bad days and difficult moments, but she felt, for the first time, like healing might actually be possible. "How are you?" Yates asked quietly as they walked Mrs. Henderson back to the boarding house. "I am." "Better," Penelope said, and realized it was true. "Not healed, not whole, but better than I was, and that feels like enough for now." Yates smiled, and the warmth in that smile made her heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing love she felt for this patient, gentle man who had learned to move quietly for her sake. In September, as the oppressive heat finally began to break and the nights grew cooler, Yates took Penelope to visit his workplace at the Double R Ranch. She had been there for the dance, but that had been at night and in a crowd. Now, in the golden light of late afternoon, she could see the ranch properly. The tidy corrals, the well-maintained barn, the bunkhouse where the cowhands lived, the main house where the owner and his family resided. Yates led her to the training corral where several horses stood watching their approach with pricked ears and curious eyes. "I want to show you something," he said, and climbed over the fence with easy grace. He approached a rangy buckskin gelding who stood in the far corner, ears pinned back and muscles tense. "This is Dusty," Yates said, his voice low and soothing. "He came to us 3 months ago. Previous owner beat him badly, used a whip and spurs and hit him when he did not obey fast enough. Now he does not trust people, does not want to be touched, spooks at sudden movements. Remind you of anyone." Penelope realized he was talking about her as much as the horse, and the comparison did not offend her. Instead, she felt a kinship with this damaged creature who had survived cruelty and was struggling to trust again. She watched as Yates approached Dusty with infinite patience, moving slowly, speaking quietly, never pushing too hard or too fast. He stood near the horse but did not try to touch him, simply existed in the same space, proving through his consistent presence that he meant no harm. After several long minutes, Dusty took one step toward Yates, then another, his ears gradually shifting from pinned back to cautiously forward. When he finally stretched his neck out and sniffed Yates's extended hand, it felt like a monumental victory. "See," Yates said, glancing at Penelope with a soft smile. "Patience and consistency, proving through actions that trust is warranted. It works for horses and humans alike." "How long did it take?" Penelope asked. "To get him to trust you even that much?" 3 months of showing up every day, of being gentle and predictable, of never losing my temper or giving up on him." Yates stroked Dusty's nose carefully, and the horse did not pull away. "And he still has bad days when he cannot bear to be touched, when the memories are too strong. But the good days are increasing. The progress is real, even if it is slow." Penelope understood the lesson he was teaching her, the metaphor he was drawing. Healing was possible, trust could be rebuilt. It simply required patience and consistency, and someone willing to show up day after day and prove through their actions that they were safe. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. "I do not know when it happened, but I love you, Yates Larson. I love your patience and your gentleness, and the way you see strength where I see weakness. I love that you learn to walk quietly for my sake. I love that you never push me to be something I am not ready to be. I love you." Yates's face transformed, joy lighting up his features in a way that made him almost beautiful. He climbed out of the corral and came to stand before her, moving slowly as always, giving her time to step back if she chose. She did not step back. Instead, she stepped forward into his arms, allowing herself to be held, allowing herself to feel safe in another person's embrace for the first time since that terrible December night. "I love you too," Yates murmured against her hair. "And I will keep showing up for you, every single day, for as long as you will let me." They stood there in the fading light, wrapped in each other's arms, while Dusty watched from his corral and the other horses grazed peacefully, and the world continued its slow turn. It was not a dramatic moment, not a grand declaration that would be sung about in ballads, but it was real and honest and deeply meaningful to two people who understood the hard work of healing and the courage it took to love again after loss. In October, Yates asked Penelope to marry him, and he did it in the quietest, most thoughtful way possible. There was no public spectacle, no surprise that might trigger her anxiety. Instead, He asked her during one of their early morning walks, in the same place where she had first told him about her family's murder, where she had first allowed herself to be vulnerable with him. "I want to spend my life with you," he said simply, holding both her hands in his. "I want to be the person you turn to on bad days and good days alike. I want to build a home with you, wherever and however that looks. I want to prove every single day that you are loved and valued and safe." He paused. "Will you marry me, Penelope Kincaid? Will you trust me with your heart and your future?" Penelope thought about everything that had led to this moment. The tragedy that had shattered her life, the fear that had defined her existence for months, the slow and difficult work of healing, the patient cowboy who had learned to move quietly for her sake. She thought about the choice before her, to remain trapped in the past or to step forward into an uncertain but potentially beautiful future. "Yes," she said, and felt the rightness of the decision settle into her bones. "Yes, I will marry you." They married in November, a small ceremony at the Catholic Church in Santa Fe with only Mrs. Henderson, the ranch owner and his wife, and a handful of close friends in attendance. Penelope wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson helped her sew, and Yates wore his best shirt and a new vest. The priest kept the ceremony brief and quiet, having been informed of Penelope's sensitivities. And when Yates kissed his new wife for the first time as a married man, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. They took a room at the boarding house temporarily, while Yates worked to finish building a small cabin on a piece of land he had purchased. 5 acres at the edge of the Double R Ranch property that his boss had sold him at a fair price. It was not much, but it was theirs, and Yates built it with his own hands, placing each board with care, thinking about the life he and Penelope would build together within those walls. The cabin was finished by January of 1879, and moving in felt like a new beginning. Penelope threw herself into making it a home, sewing curtains and arranging their few pieces of furniture, planting a garden that would bloom in the spring, learning to cook on the new stove that Yates had insisted on purchasing despite the cost. She still had bad days when the fear overwhelmed her, when loud sounds sent her spiraling, when the memories pressed too close. But increasingly there were good days too, days when she laughed freely, when she felt light and unburdened, when the future seemed bright with possibility. Yates continued to work with horses, building a reputation as someone with a special gift for handling difficult animals. People began bringing him their problem horses, the ones other trainers had given up on, and Yates patiently worked with each one, applying the same principles he had used with Dusty and with Penelope herself: patience, consistency, gentleness, and an unshakable belief that healing was possible. Penelope, meanwhile, began tutoring children in reading and arithmetic, working from their cabin several afternoons a week. She found purpose in teaching, in passing on the knowledge her parents had valued so highly, in helping young minds expand and grow. The work was rewarding and kept her connected to the community without overwhelming her limited tolerance for chaos and noise. In the spring of 1879, Penelope realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror. She wanted this child, wanted to build a family with Yates, but she was also afraid of everything that could go wrong, of loss and tragedy striking again when she had something precious to protect. Yates held her when she cried, reassured her when the anxiety spiraled, and reminded her gently that fear was understandable but should not rob her of the joy of this moment. They would take precautions, be as careful as possible, but they could not live in constant terror of potential tragedy. They had to trust that the universe would not be so cruel as to take everything from her twice. "Our child will be so loved," Yates promised, And you will be an extraordinary mother, Penelope. I have no doubt about that. The pregnancy was not easy. Penelope dealt with severe nausea in the early months and anxiety throughout, but Yates was steadfast in his support, taking on extra work around the cabin, rubbing her aching back, reading to her on days when she felt too exhausted to move. Mrs. Henderson visited regularly, bringing food and advice and the kind of practical support that made all the difference. In December, almost exactly a year after the night that had shattered Penelope's first life, she went into labor. It was a difficult birth, long and exhausting, attended by Mrs. Henderson and a midwife from town. Yates waited outside, pacing and anxious, occasionally hearing cries that made him want to burst through the door but respecting the women's insistence that he stay out. When it was finally over, Mrs. Henderson emerged with a tired but genuine smile. "You have a son," she told Yates, "and Penelope is exhausted but well. Give us a few minutes to clean up, then you can come in." Yates entered the bedroom to find his wife propped up against pillows, looking pale and drained but radiant, with a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, snuffling sounds that were probably the most beautiful thing Yates had ever heard. "Meet your son," Penelope said softly, her eyes shining with tears. "I thought we could name him Samuel, after my brother, if that is all right with you." Yates felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It is perfect," he managed. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny person they had created, this fragile new life that represented hope and healing and the possibility of joy after tragedy. "Hello, Samuel. I am your father, and I promise to do everything in my power to keep you and your mother safe and happy." Baby Samuel opened his eyes, unfocused and dark, and made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been hunger or might have been nothing at all except an infant working through his new existence. Either way, it made both his parents smile through their tears. The first weeks of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and unexpectedly wonderful. Penelope struggled with the lack of sleep and the constant demands of a newborn, but she also found unexpected strength in her fierce love for this tiny person who depended on her completely. When Samuel cried, loud and insistent, it no longer sent her spiraling into panic. Instead, it activated something maternal and protective, a need to soothe and comfort that overrode her anxiety. Yates was a natural father, patient and gentle with their son the same way he was with frightened horses and traumatized people. He walked Samuel around the cabin in the middle of the night, singing soft songs in his rumbling voice. He changed diapers without complaint and marveled at every tiny milestone, every small sound or facial expression. As winter gave way to spring and Samuel grew from a tiny newborn into a more substantial infant, Penelope felt herself continuing to heal. The nightmares became less frequent. The loud sound still made her flinch, but the intensity of her reaction lessened. She was learning, slowly but surely, that the past did not have to define the present, that joy and sorrow could coexist, that healing was not about forgetting but about integrating the painful memories into the larger story of her life. On a warm afternoon in April, Penelope sat on the porch of their cabin with Samuel in her arms while Yates worked with a young horse in the nearby corral. The baby was awake and alert, his dark eyes watching the world with solemn curiosity, and Penelope felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened her. "Your grandmother and grandfather would have loved you so much," she told Samuel quietly. "Your uncle, too. They would have been so proud to see you, to know that our family continues despite everything that tried to destroy it." She kissed his downy head. "I carry them with me every day, little one, their love and their sacrifice, and I try to live in a way that would make them proud. I think I am getting better at it." Samuel made a small cooing sound, and Penelope chose to interpret it as agreement. The years passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Samuel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's serious expression. Though he laughed freely and often, a bright spot in their quiet household. Yates's horse training business continued to grow, and he hired a young man named James to help with the work, expanding their small operation into something more substantial. Penelope's tutoring evolved into a proper small school that met in the church hall, teaching a dozen children of various ages the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In 1881, Penelope gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara. The birth was easier than Samuel's had been, and Clara was a calm, contented baby who seemed to inherit her father's patient nature. Samuel, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, bringing diapers and blankets and singing to her in his high, off-key voice. The family thrived. Their cabin expanded with an added room for the children and a separate building for Yates's horse training work. The garden flourished under Penelope's care, providing vegetables and herbs that supplemented the income from Yates's work and Penelope's teaching. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. Penelope still had difficult days when the memories rose up too strongly, when anxiety clenched tight around her chest, when she flinched at sudden sounds. But those days were increasingly rare, and she had learned strategies to manage them. Breathing exercises, talking through the panic with Yates, reminding herself that she was safe, that the past was past, that she had survived and built a beautiful life from the ashes of tragedy. She also learned that healing was not a destination but a journey, that some scars never fully faded, and that was all right. The trauma she had experienced was part of her story, but it was not the whole story. She was also a wife, a mother, a teacher, a friend. She was also a woman who had found the courage to love again, to trust again, to hope again despite every reason to remain closed off and afraid. In 1883, on a crisp autumn morning that reminded Penelope of those first early walks with Yates 5 years earlier, she stood on the porch of their cabin and watched her husband teaching Samuel to ride. The boy, now 4 years old, sat proudly on a gentle mare while Yates walked beside him, one hand on the saddle to keep him steady, his voice low and encouraging. Clara played at Penelope's feet, building towers from wooden blocks that Samuel had carved, and the whole scene was so perfectly ordinary, so beautifully normal, that Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. This was what her parents had died to give her. A chance at life, at happiness, at a future. This was what she had fought so hard to build despite the fear and pain. A family, a home, a life worth living. This was what loving Yates and being loved by him had made possible, healing that went deep enough to allow for genuine joy. Yates looked up from his work with Samuel and caught her eye. Even from a distance, she could see the warmth in his expression, the love that had only deepened and matured over their years together. He had kept every promise he made to her that morning when he proposed. He had shown up every day, had been patient on the hard days and celebratory on the good ones, had proven through consistent action that she was safe with him, that his love was steady and true and unwavering. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he smiled, that same gentle smile that had made her feel seen and valued from the very beginning. Samuel waved enthusiastically, nearly toppling from the saddle, and Yates caught him with easy competence, riding him and making the boy giggle. That evening, after the children were asleep and the chores were done, Penelope and Yates sat together on the porch in the cool darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. Yates had his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his warmth, feeling perfectly content. "You remember when we first met?" Penelope asked. "When I dropped my basket because your spurs startled me." "I remember thinking you were the most frightened creature I had ever seen," Yates said. "And also the bravest, though I do not think you knew that about yourself yet." "I did not feel brave. I felt broken." "You were wounded, not broken. There is a difference." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And look at you now, look at what you have built. Look at the life you have created despite everything that tried to destroy you." Penelope thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that terrible December night to this peaceful autumn evening. She thought about the grief she still carried for her first family, the parents and brother who would always hold a piece of her heart. She thought about the guilt that had nearly consumed her, and how she had learned, slowly and with great difficulty, to forgive herself for surviving. She thought about the fear that had ruled her life and how, bit by bit, she had reclaimed her power from it. "I could not have done it without you," she said quietly. "You gave me space to heal. You learned to move quietly for my sake. You never pushed me to be anything other than what I was capable of being in each moment. That gift, that patience, that unconditional acceptance, it saved my life as surely as hiding in that cellar did." "We saved each other," Yates corrected gently. "You taught me that love is not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It is about showing up consistently, about paying attention to what someone needs, about adjusting your behavior to make the person you love feel safe and valued. You made me a better man, Penelope. You made me think more carefully about how I move through the world and how my actions affect others." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the countryside, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, the gentle sound of horses moving in the corral, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. "You think we will have more children?" Penelope asked eventually. "Would you want to, maybe, someday, when Clara is a bit older?" Penelope smiled. "I like being a mother. It is hard work, but it is good work, and I think Samuel and Clara would benefit from more siblings." "Then we will see what the future brings," Yates said. "For now, I am grateful for what we have. A home, healthy children, meaningful work, and each other. That is more than many people ever have." Penelope knew he was right. They had built something precious here, something worth fighting for and protecting. And while she knew that life was unpredictable and that tragedy could strike at any moment, she also knew that she was stronger now than she had been 5 years ago. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine and come through it. She had learned to live with loss and fear without being consumed by either. She had learned that healing was possible, that love was worth the risk, that joy could emerge even from the deepest pain. In 1885, Penelope did indeed become pregnant again, and in the early spring of 1886, she gave birth to twin girls they named Rose and Lily. The births were surprisingly easy, and the babies were healthy and vigorous, filling the cabin with their cries and demands. Samuel, now 7, appointed himself their chief protector, while 5-year-old Clara enjoyed having babies she could help care for, bringing bottles and blankets and singing them the same lullabies her mother sang. The expanded family required more space, so Yates built another addition onto the cabin, giving the girls their own room and expanding the main living area. He also purchased additional acreage and increased his horse training operation, hiring 2 more men to help with the work. The family was not wealthy, but they were prosperous enough, and more importantly, they were happy and healthy and thriving. Penelope's school continued to grow as well, and by 1887, She was teaching nearly 20 children and had hired a young woman named Emily to assist her. The work was demanding but deeply rewarding, and Penelope took pride in knowing that she was making a real difference in these children's lives, giving them opportunities for education and advancement that might otherwise be unavailable. As the years continued to pass, Penelope's relationship with her trauma evolved. The nightmares became rare, occurring only a few times a year rather than nightly or weekly. The startle response to loud noises lessened significantly, though it never disappeared completely. She learned to talk about her first family without breaking down, to remember them with love rather than only grief, to honor their memory by living fully rather than by drowning in guilt. She also learned that trauma was not something that could be completely overcome or left behind. It was part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was, and that was all right. The key was not to let it define her entire identity, not to allow it to steal her present joy in the name of past pain. She was a survivor, yes, but she was also so much more than that. In 1890, on their 11th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Penelope with a trip to Albuquerque, arranging for Mrs. Henderson to stay with the children for a long weekend. It was the first time they had been alone together, without the demands of children or work, since before Samuel was born, and the freedom of it was intoxicating. They stayed in a modest hotel, ate meals they did not have to prepare themselves, and wandered the streets hand in hand like the young couple they had been all those years ago. They talked about their children, their dreams, their plans for the future. They made love with a freedom and privacy they rarely experienced at home, rediscovering each other without the constant interruptions of family life. On their last evening in Albuquerque, as they sat in the hotel room watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Penelope turned to her husband and said, "Thank you." For what? For everything. For learning to move quietly, for your patience. For never giving up on me even when I was at my worst. For building this beautiful life with me. For loving me despite my damage and my fear. For being exactly who you are. She took his hand. "I know I do not say it often enough, but you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Yates Larson. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." Yates pulled her close, holding her the way he had held her countless times over the years, steady and sure and infinitely gentle. "You saved mine too," he said quietly. "You taught me what real strength looks like. You showed me that gentleness is not weakness. You gave me a family and a purpose and a reason to be the best version of myself. I am the man I am because of you, Penelope. I am honored to be your husband and the father of your children, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the trust you placed in me." They held each other as the light faded and the stars emerged, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of tragedy and built something beautiful from broken pieces. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge, triumph and difficulty. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his father's talent with horses and his mother's love of learning. Clara developed a gift for music and spent hours at the piano they had scrimped and saved to purchase. The twins, Rose and Lily, were as different as night and day despite being identical in appearance. One outgoing and adventurous, the other shy and studious. In 1895, Samuel left home to attend college in Denver, the first person in either Penelope's or Yates's families to pursue higher education. It was bittersweet to see him go, but Penelope was fiercely proud of the young man he had become, and she knew her parents would have been proud too. Clara married at 19 to a kind young man who worked at the general store, and they settled in Santa Fe, close enough for frequent visits. The twins, now 9 years old, showed no signs of wanting to leave anytime soon, filling the house with their constant chatter and activity. Yates, now in his mid-40s, had silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still strong and capable, still patient and gentle, still the steady presence that had anchored Penelope through every storm. His reputation as a horse trainer had spread throughout the territory, and people came from as far away as Texas to work with him, knowing that if anyone could help a difficult horse, it was Yates Larson. Penelope, at 43, had found a confidence and contentment she never could have imagined in those early days after the tragedy. The fear that had once ruled her life had been reduced to a manageable companion, something she was aware of but no longer controlled by. She still flinched occasionally at unexpected loud sounds, still had moments when the memories pressed close, but they were moments, not hours or days, and she had developed the tools to work through them without being overwhelmed. She looked in the mirror sometimes and saw traces of the frightened young woman who had arrived in Santa Fe 17 years ago, but mostly she saw someone different. A woman who had survived, who had healed, who had built a life of purpose and meaning from the ashes of tragedy. She saw a mother, a wife, a teacher, a friend. She saw strength she had earned through hard work and courage she had cultivated through facing her fears day after day after day. In the summer of 1900, Penelope and Yates celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a party that filled their home and spilled out into the yard. Their children were there, along with grandchildren, Clara having blessed them with 2 babies in quick succession. Mrs. Henderson, now elderly and frail but still sharp as a tack, sat in the place of honor and regaled the younger generation with stories of how their parents had met and fallen in love. As Penelope looked around at the gathered crowd, at the family and friends who had become part of their story, she felt overwhelming gratitude for the life she had been given, or rather, the life she had built through determination and courage and the help of a gentle cowboy who had learned to move quietly for her sake. Yates found her in a quiet moment, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Penelope said. "The journey that brought us here, the people we have lost and the people we have gained, the life we have built together." She turned to face him fully. "I was thinking about how different things could have been if you had not been patient with me, if you had not adjusted your whole way of being to help me feel safe. I was thinking about how lucky I am." "We are both lucky," Yates corrected. "Lucky to have found each other, lucky to have built this life together, lucky to have love that has only deepened over time." He brushed a strand of gray-streaked hair back from her face. "I love you, Penelope Larson. I have loved you from the moment I saw you frightened and fragile in that Santa Fe street, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Penelope said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you for learning to move quietly. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for teaching me that healing is possible and that love is worth the risk." They stood together in their yard, surrounded by the noise and laughter of celebration, and Penelope realized she was not flinching at the sound. The voices that rose around her were voices of love and joy, of family and community, of life being lived fully and without fear. And standing beside her, as he had stood for 20 years, was the man who had made all of it possible through his unwavering patience and gentle love. The sun set over the New Mexico landscape, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Penelope Kincaid Larson, survivor of tragedy and builder of a beautiful life, looked at her husband and her family, and knew with absolute certainty that she had done what her parents would have wanted. She had survived. She had thrived. She had honored their memory by refusing to let trauma steal her capacity for joy. She had learned to live again, fully and completely, and that was the greatest victory of all.